Let's get into some of the issues going on today, and the biggest one right now is what's going on in the state of Israel, and I want to give you a little bit of a background here. What happened a few days ago is that the highest court in Israel ruled, and it's an extraordinarily liberal court, and it upheld a lower court decision in Jerusalem, that 4 properties that were owned by 4 Arabs didn't belong to those Arabs, that this had been a Jewish community prior to 1948, and when Israel fought for and received its independence, what happened is Jordan and the Palestinians swept into parts of Israel, including Judea and Samaria, and including Jerusalem, and stole it from the Jewish people. You have a neighborhood there in Jerusalem that's only a couple thousand years old and was a Jewish community. And the Arabs and the Palestinians took these homes from the Jews. 1967, Israel fights a defensive war because the Arab nations are coalescing again to attack Israel, and Israel attacks them first. And in doing so, Israel takes back much of Jerusalem, as well as the heights where the Al-Aqsa Mosque is. That is said to be among the holiest sites of the Muslims. What the Muslims did a long time ago is they built this mosque where the Second Temple was. So they purposely built the mosque where the Second Temple was, and the temple is, if not the holiest site, among the holiest site of the Jews. And so when the Israelis took that in 1967, Moshe Dayan, who was the general in that sector, he decided that they would give it back to the Palestinians, except under Israeli control, because what the Jordanians and the Palestinians did when they controlled Jerusalem is they destroyed the synagogues. They destroyed all the Jewish symbols, all the Jewish heritage there. And the Israelis said that's not going to happen again. And so there you have the situation there. But what happened in the 1950s, Jewish courts ruled that, yes, those homes belong to these Jewish families. But oddly enough, they said if the Arabs pay rent, that they'll be allowed to stay there. Now, that wasn't exactly what the Jewish families wanted. They wanted their homes back. But the Arabs wouldn't pay their rent. And for over 50 years, they didn't pay their rent. And so they became squatters. And so these families sued again and said, hey, we want our property back. And they won. And they were told those 4 families have to leave. So this is where it begins. Abbas, who pretends to be a martyr, but he's a terrorist, who treats his people like crap, despite the billions of dollars that come into the Palestinian Authority. He used the occasion, and you can even go to Facebook and read some of the things he has said, to try and ignite another intifada, that is, a war against Israel. And so what happened in the mosque is the Israeli police and security forces came under attack, and you've seen some of the film of that. Young Palestinians have been attacking Jews and attacking places in Jerusalem proper, and so there's been a response to that, some of the rioting that's taking place. Abbas is urging them to fight, and his second in command is urging them to kill. Hamas in the Gaza Strip, because the Israelis gave the Gaza Strip to the Palestinians, a huge mistake under Sharon. They thought they would get peace, and you see what's happened. It's basically a launching point for terrorism and missiles. So Hamas, obviously coordinating with Abbas, and there's going to be an election about whether Hamas takes over for the Palestinian Authority. So now they're trying to out-terrorism each other, if you will. So Hamas is now firing hundreds and hundreds of missiles into Israel, including trying to hit Jerusalem. And it has come very close to Jerusalem. It now has more advanced missiles, thanks to whom? The Iranian regime, which has given them more advanced missiles. And they're trying all kinds of tactics now to get around the Israeli defense system called the Iron Dome. And by the way, no defense system can defeat hundreds and hundreds of missiles. So what they're doing now is they're shooting their missiles low to try and avoid the Iron Dome system where they meet missile to missile. much like the defense system we have. And the Israelis further developed it and gave us the technology, by the way, our military. And so now the Israeli jets and drones are attacking positions in the Gaza Strip. So what's the Biden administration doing? The Biden administration has already sold out to the Palestinian terrorists, whereas Donald Trump put tough measures in place, refused to subsidize them to hundreds of millions of dollars a year because they won't give up their terrorism activities. They won't come to the table and talk peace. So Trump cut them off. Well, Biden has provided them with more resources, the way he's doing with Iran. So for 4 years under Trump, we had peace in the Middle East. We had more peace breaking out in the Middle East between Israel and a number of its Arab neighbors. The Palestinians were very careful not to provoke the Israelis or the United States. And so in the first 100 days of Biden says, well, we know better, two-state solution. We're going to provide them with the resources that Trump took away. We're going to look at ways to accommodate the Palestinians. And while we're at it, we're going to open a new deal with the Iranians. And they're giving the Iranians money, or going to, and they're lifting sanctions against the Iranians. So the Palestinian terrorists and Hamas, they see this. The Iranians see this. They see that Israel no longer has a strong supporter in the United States government. Biden, the Secretary of State, is a disaster. The National Security Advisor is, in my view, an anti-Semite. That's my opinion. They're surrounded with these people. They keep talking about Israel's an apartheid society. Israel's trying to survive. It's trying to defend itself. Imagine missiles being fired from Canada, Mexico, into any of our cities, what we would do. Then I'm watching the reporting on this. Even from Fox, my favorite network, they have an individual who is posted in Jerusalem, traveling throughout Israel, who clearly is no fan of the state of Israel. And the most radical elements in the Palestinian different regimes, they allow him to come in and take pictures and talk to them, and that's why. And so he reports today in part, as have others, that several children have died in the Gaza Strip as a result of the Israeli airstrikes. I want you to think about that for a second. This is what the New York Times does. This is what the Washington Post does. This is what all of them do. Israel's trying to defend itself. One of its other towns is under constant attack. They lost 2 people there already. Scores have been injured. They start firing missiles from Gaza Strip. The Palestinians start the riot in Jerusalem. They're heating up the situation even more. And our government talks about both sides need to tamp it down. And our reporters talk about how many Palestinians are injured and how many Palestinian children are injured. Do you know how hard it is for a jet fighter to target its missiles so it doesn't kill any children? And yet the Israelis do that better than any force on the face of the earth. They know what the Hamas terrorists are up to. They have Hamas missile building factories under elementary schools, under their mosques. And then they point to the Israelis. And here's the thing, all the reporters in the region know this. They all know it. And yet they still report this way. And so now you know more about this situation than almost anybody. Now let's take a look at CBS This Morning and see how they reported on it. Go.
We're going to stay overseas now and go to a deadly outbreak of violence in the Middle East. Overnight, Palestinian militants and Israeli forces exchanged rockets and missiles after several days of...
Okay, first of all, the missiles weren't exchanged. The Hamas terrorists fired missiles into Israeli cities and tried to hit Jerusalem. Netanyahu the other day warned them. He said, you keep this up, we're going to hammer you. We're going to hit you. And then they fired even more. And so the Israeli Air Force is attacking. And 5,000 or so IDF soldiers have amassed on that border. And so what's going to happen at some point, if it keeps up, is the Israelis are going to send in some of their infantry, and their casualties are going to start to go significantly higher. So the Israelis don't seek this. The Israelis didn't seek this. The Palestinians are purposely doing this because they think this is their time to put pressure on Israel through the United States. They don't care how many people die. It's like any other Marxist entity or terrorist entity. People are fodder to the leaders of these movements. Go ahead.
After several days of clashes centered on one of Islam's holiest sites in Jerusalem. Elizabeth Palmer is following all this for
Now
us.
listen to that. Several days centered on one of Islam's holiest sites. It also happens to be one of the Jews' holiest sites, which they're never allowed to visit. But look how they put it. The Palestinians start the fight in the mosque. And he doesn't mention that. He doesn't mention any kind of level of what's taken place and why it's taken place. Go ahead.
Good morning. Well, I can tell you that the situation is still very tense as we speak. In fact, there hasn't been this level of violence and confrontation since 6 days of heavy fighting back in 2019.
Hamas rockets streaking from Gaza toward Israel lit up the night sky. And so did the glow of Israeli retaliatory airstrikes. Israel says it hit Hamas military targets, but this morning, Gazans inspected collateral damage.
And this is how it works. She's in London. They feed this stuff. Israel's trying to hit military sites. Who knows what's under this building, if anything? This is a quasi-war at this point. You're sending in your jet fighters. God knows how fast they're going. And it's Israel's fault. Collateral damage, Israel.
For all this and much more, sign up for Levin TV.